Hello. Let me start telling you a secret. This is my first time here at the Moore House. And sometimes I do have fear. I'm very excited to be here tonight in such a special event. First of all, because it is hosted by a dear organization, the Center for the Democracy in the Americas, an organization I got in touch with some years ago, meeting with Sarah Stevens and with Linda Garrett. Not here, but in San Salvador. A fact that already says a lot about them. It is great to see how they engage on site and get a perspective from a wide variety of sources in El Salvador. They know my country firsthand, which allows them to produce reports that are not only accurate, but also useful. Their work promoting democracy derives also directly from their work denouncing human rights abuses. And I am thankful for their efforts and a work full of hope for the construction of better societies. And when I say I'm thankful, I say it as an American, meaning a human being originary of the Americas. I'm sure tonight, Sarah, Kurt, all the people from the Center for Democracy in the Americas, you will find generous people who will be willing to acompañarnos and understand the importance of your work, which I, living in El Salvador and working there as a journalist, can testify about how important it is for us. 2 decades after the end of our civil war, El Salvador is now one of the most violent countries on earth, threatened also by the explosive combination of organized crime and high impunity. And impunity is something we know for many years back that peace didn't change. A woman that has dedicated her life not only to bear witness, but to try to make amends is with us tonight. A woman that in her pursuit for the establishment of the truth, the punishment of crimes against humanity, and the restoration of dignity to the victims, has made much more for Salvadorans looking for justice than most of my countrymen. It is my honor then to present one of the most extraordinary and dear human beings I have ever met. For those of you who don't know her, Professor Terry Karl has taught at Stanford about human rights for many years. She has become an inspiring force and a determinant influence in the formation of better human beings. She has received many recognitions and awards for her academic work, but it is about time that she gets recognized for her indomitable pursuit of justice and personal commitment to the fight against impunity. She is one of the most knowledgeable persons in the world about El Salvador, which is my country. First, as a student, then as a congressional staff, then as an academic, also as part of the United Nations mission to El Salvador, and now as the expert on every single process against human rights violators and war criminals that is held outside my country. I met her almost a decade ago at Stanford, and it was very easy to get seduced by her strong defense for memory, reparation for the victims, and especially her fight against impunity. Terry believes justice is the way to the restoration of dignity to the victims, but also to keep the record straight and establish the truth about what happened during the years of our civil war and why it happened. And she does it with an intellectual curiosity that is just contagious. This morning, I asked Susan Adelman, her longtime friend, what she would say about Terry. And Susan replied, she is loyal to death, more demanding for herself than for others, but also more forgiving to others than to herself. I think that describes her well. But let me tell you a short story. During an investigation on the murder of Archbishop Oscar Romero, I had several interview sessions with one of the killers, sessions which were emotionally strong. The guy was left by himself, and he was hiding in a remote mountain. living in very poor conditions with health problems. He had lost contact with his family many years ago, and his son even changed his name because he was embarrassed to be related to him. So I called Terry one day, and I told her I felt I was completely losing it. She asked me why. I said, I'm having these long conversations with this assassin. He represents everything that is repulsive to me, and still I feel some empathy with him. Terry calmly replied, you shouldn't feel bad about it. In fact, that is exactly what makes you different from him, that you are able to see some humanity even in him. Of course, that simple phrase changed my perspective of life forever. I am deeply honored to present tonight a truly unsung hero, a woman that has changed and keeps changing the lives of many people, a person we all feel so proud to have among us, and my own referral of hope for humanity, our dear Terry Karl.
Andrea, where are you, Andrea? Here you are. Andrea stole my theme. So I'm not going to repeat what you said about Sarah, about the center. I know everybody's hot, but I want to second it, first of all. And I wouldn't have put it in exactly the same words, but I do want to say something. A couple months ago, for the first time in the history of the United States, in what Amnesty International called a landmark ruling in the United States, the Department of Homeland Security ruled that General Vitas Casanova should be deported for the United States for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and his participation in ordering murder and torture. We have never deported anyone before who was not a Nazi. So this is the first time that we have specifically, for crimes against humanity, used deportation as a human rights tool. We can now use it from now on. We won't be just deporting people because they lied on their form. We won't be just deporting people because they're working illegally in the United States. But we now have a precedent, and we can, thanks to the work of this organization and many other organizations, use both deportation, and I won't explain why, also extradition, as instruments of the defense of human rights. The reason we were able to deport, or get the ruling that we did for the deportation of General Vitas, is that in 2002 we won a civil case against General Vitas and General Garcia for the torture of Salvadoran citizens. And it took from 2002 to a couple months ago to move from human rights organizations defending human rights to the Department of Homeland Security agreeing to use its resources in these kinds of trials and these kinds of events. That would not have happened if it weren't for a lot of people, most of whom are not in this room, by the way, because I did come out from California. But I want to mention a couple of them. And the first thing I want to do is ask everybody who's here who worked in El Salvador in the 80s to please stand up. Janet, that's you. Come on, Bill. Come on out. Sandra. Is George here? No. Others? The 80s. Now, would you just stay standing? All of those who began working on El Salvador in the 90s, will you stand up? 90s, come on. All of you who went to El Salvador in the last year, Layla, come on. All of you worked on El Salvador, Lisa. Susan, you were there in the 80s, stand up. Carlos, you're working on it now, stand up. The reason I'm doing this, Sandra Culver, who was the author of the first trial against Generals Vitas Casanova and General Garcia, at least her organization was. Without all of you, there would have been no trial, period. And I can say this for a fact because I have read every word any of you have ever written on El Salvador, tracked through every single human rights abuse that people documented. So instead of just talking about accompaniment, I was just going to say, I'll let you sit down now. I'm sorry. I was going to start with the phrase that's been on my door at Stanford since I started teaching, which is a phrase by Margaret Mead, all of you know probably. Never say that 1, 2, or 3 people can't change the world. It's the only thing that does. And what I learned is that that's actually not quite true. It does take a village. It means that I read what somebody named Jamera Rohn wrote in 1979 for these trials. I read every word that Ambassador Robert White has ever written in his life for these trials. I look at every report that David Holliday ever produced for these trials, and I can go on and on and on. So do my colleagues, Patty Blum, who can't be here tonight, and Sean Roberts. So I am the vehicle through which all of this information is gathered that allows us to say that the very people that were our leading allies in the United States in the 1980s are now judged as war criminals and human rights abusers, and they will go down in our court history as that. And it is my absolute conviction that later in El Salvador, they will go down in Salvador's history in the same way. And that it is our obligation and our duty to make sure that the kinds of acts of mass state terror and genocide that many of us saw in Central America, in El Salvador and Guatemala, do not stand. And that those people who commit those acts have some accountability, whether it's deportation, whether it's extradition, hopefully it's jail, and most hopefully it will be, in the future, the end of impunity in El Salvador and the end of the very illegal general amnesty law that protects the perpetrators in El Salvador, even to this day, for the continued abuse of human rights that they're still involved in. Thank you.